According to investigators, Susan Erica Avalon did not act out of sudden rage or confusion. Prosecutors say the pressure had been building for years, centered on unresolved child support and custody conflict that never truly ended after divorce. One former husband, the Manatee County victim, had been divorced from Avalon for about 11 years. Yet court records show she still owed him roughly $4,000 in back child support. Authorities argue that the debt was not just financial, it represented an ongoing loss of control, a reminder that separation had not freed her from obligation or oversight. Investigators describe a long pattern in which legal boundaries became emotional fault lines. Support enforcement notices, custody arrangements, and repeated court involvement kept Avalon tied to both former spouses long after the marriages were legally over. Friends and acquaintances later told reporters that Avalon appeared increasingly overwhelmed and resentful. Prosecutors say that over time, what began as disputes over money and parenting shifted into something more rigid, a belief that the system had stripped her of authority, dignity, and identity. By late 2025, Avalon was 51 years old and living in Citrus County, Florida. Law enforcement records show that both former husbands remained active figures in her life through family court obligations. One lived in Manatee County near Bradenton. The other lived in Hillsborough County in the Tampa area. Investigators believe those geographic connections, combined with unresolved emotional conflict, shaped what unfolded next. The day everything collapsed was December 17, 2025. That morning, deputies in Manatee County responded to a reported shooting at a residential home. Inside lived one of Avalon's ex-husbands, a 54-year-old man, along with his teenage daughter. According to the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, Avalon did not arrive openly or by chance. Investigators allege she used what they later described as the Panera ruse. Authorities say a stolen Panera bread delivery order was used to get the victim to open his front door. Prosecutors argue this detail matters because it suggests deception and planning rather than a spontaneous confrontation. When the door opened, investigators allege the shooting occurred. The victim's 15-year-old daughter was inside the home at the time. She did not witness the gunfire directly, but she heard multiple shots. Moments later, she told deputies she saw a silver Honda Odyssey speeding away from the residence. That observation would become a critical piece of the case. It established a vehicle description, a direction of travel, and a narrow time window. The victim was found suffering from gunshot wounds and later died from his injuries. At first, the Manatee County shooting appeared to be a single homicide, but as detectives began notifying family members and known associates, the investigation shifted dramatically. Law enforcement contacted Susan Avalon as part of routine follow-up. According to multiple reports, deputies observed her cleaning her vehicle when they arrived. During questioning, officers referenced one of her former husbands. Avalon allegedly responded with a brief question that immediately raised concern. Which one? That response prompted urgent action. Investigators quickly initiated a welfare check on Avalon's second ex-husband, who lived in Hillsborough County. Officers arrived later that same day and found him dead inside his home, also from gunshot wounds. The realization came quickly. Two former spouses had been killed in two different counties within the same day, and the same suspect was connected to both scenes. Detectives began reconstructing Avalon's movements hour by hour. Surveillance footage, license plate reader data, and witness statements placed a silver Honda Odyssey traveling between Manatee County and Hillsborough County within a tight time frame. Prosecutors would later argue that the sequence showed purposeful movement rather than coincidence. Authorities also reviewed court documents, child support records, and enforcement actions involving both victims. In the Manatee County case, investigators emphasized the $4,000 child support arrearage and long-standing conflict tied to custody and authority. Avalon was taken into custody and charged in Manatee County with second-degree murder. A judge ordered her held without bond, citing the severity of the allegations and the risk factors involved. At the same time, the the Manatee County Sheriff's Office publicly stated that investigators intended to seek first-degree murder charges and were reviewing the case for possible pursuit of the death penalty. Authorities confirmed that charges related to the Hillsborough County killing were still under active review as part of a coordinated multi-county prosecution. Prosecutors have framed the case as one of escalation rather than impulse. They point to the alleged use of deception to gain access to the Manatee County victim, the rapid movement between counties, and the targeting of two former spouses on the same day. In public statements, officials have emphasized that the violence was not random. They argue it was the endpoint of unresolved conflict that had tightened over time. The presence of a child during the Manatee County shooting has added another layer of gravity. Prosecutors have repeatedly noted that the 15-year-old daughter, who heard gunfire and watched the suspected vehicle flee, represents the collateral harm of unresolved adult conflict. Officials have said her experience is one reason they are considering the most serious charges available under Florida law. As of when this video was uploaded, Susan Erica Avalon remains in custody. The legal process is ongoing, and outcomes have not yet been determined. Additional charges and sentencing considerations remain under review across jurisdictions. As the case moves through the court system, I would appreciate it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for the support. Let's move to the second case. Dana Chandler did not disappear from Mike Cisco's life when their marriage ended. The divorce closed a legal chapter, but it did not resolve the conflict that followed. What remained was a long, unresolved struggle shaped by control, resentment, and a belief that shared history created a lasting claim. Over more than 20 years, that belief would be examined again and again inside courtrooms, making this one of the most prolonged homicide prosecutions in Kansas history. Dana Chandler and Mike Cisco married in the 1980s and later divorced under tense circumstances. Testimony and court filings showed that the separation did not bring distance or closure. Disputes over finances, property, and authority continued well after the marriage was legally over. Friends and acquaintances later described the relationship as combative even after divorce. The past was not allowed to settle. It remained active, personal, and unresolved. By the early 2000s, Mike Cisco was living in Topeka, Kansas, with his partner, Karen Harkness. Their daily life appeared ordinary. There were no reports of escalating public conflict, threats, or outside danger. That sense of normalcy ended on July 7, 2002. On that day, police were called to Cisco's home. Inside, they found Mike Cisco and Karen Harkness dead from gunshot wounds. Investigators immediately focused on what the scene did not show. There were no broken doors, no forced windows, no evidence of robbery. Nothing appeared disturbed or taken. The absence of forced entry suggested familiarity. Whoever entered the home likely did so without resistance. From the earliest stages, detectives centered the investigation on motive rather than mystery. The crime did not appear random. Prosecutors would later argue that the killings did not come from strangers entering Cisco's life, but from someone who believed she still belonged inside it. Over time, attention returned repeatedly to Dana Chandler. The investigation did not move quickly. Years passed without charges. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed. Statements were revisited. The case remained open, but unresolved. Nearly a decade after the murders, it reached its first courtroom conclusion. In 2012, Dana Chandler was tried and found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no DNA placing Chandler at the crime scene, no firearm conclusively linked to her. Instead, prosecutors presented a narrative built around motive, resentment, and a refusal to accept the loss of authority after divorce. Chandler was sentenced to life in prison. For several years, that verdict appeared final, but the conviction rested on a foundation that would later be exposed as compromised. In 2018, the Kansas Supreme Court vacated Chandler's convictions. The reason was not newly discovered evidence or a technical error. It was prosecutorial misconduct. The court found that the lead prosecutor, Jackie Spradling, had falsely told jurors that Mike Cisco had obtained a protection from abuse order against Dana Chandler. That order never existed. The false statement was significant. It directly shaped how jurors were asked to interpret Chandler's behavior and credibility. The Kansas Supreme Court ruled that the misconduct compromised the fairness of the trial and required the convictions to be overturned. A new trial was ordered, and Chandler was released while awaiting retrial. Spradling was later disbarred. The ruling reset the case entirely. A conviction that had stood for years was erased, not because the facts of the crime had changed, but because the process had failed. The second trial did not occur until August 2022. By then, the case carried 20 years of history. Evidence was old. Witnesses' memories were less precise. The courtroom also carried the weight of the overturned conviction. Once again, the prosecution presented its theory of entitlement after separation. The defense challenged the reliability of witnesses and emphasized the lack of physical evidence. After deliberations, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. The result was a hung jury and a mistrial. Chandler was released on bond. For the first time since 2002, the case stood without a conviction and without closure. At that point, the question extended beyond guilt or innocence. It became a question of endurance. Would the state pursue the case again after an overturned conviction and a mistrial? The answer came in early 2025. The third trial began in early February, more than 22 years after the murders. This proceeding marked a dramatic shift. Dana Chandler chose to represent herself. She questioned witnesses directly, addressed the jury on her own behalf, and managed her defense without counsel. The trial unfolded slowly, shaped by decades of prior proceedings. During this period, a significant personal tragedy occurred. Two of Chandler's sisters were killed in a car accident while traveling to attend the trial. Their deaths prompted a temporary recess in the proceedings. The pause added a human weight to a case already defined by time and loss. When the trial resumed, the prosecution again focused on its central theme. The argument remained consistent. Chandler never accepted the end of the marriage as the end of her claim. Shared history, they argued, had been reinterpreted as lifelong entitlement. Mike Cisco's new life represented exclusion rather than separation. On March 7, 2025, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Dana Chandler was found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. In June 2025, Chandler was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Under Kansas law, each life sentence carries a mandatory minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility. Because the sentences were ordered to run consecutively, Chandler must serve 50 years before she can be considered for parole. The court credited her with roughly 10 years previously served from earlier incarceration related to the overturned conviction. Even with that credit, parole eligibility remains decades away. 1 case, 3 trials, and a conclusion that took more than 20 years to arrive. Moving away from that, Case 3 comes up next. Betty Broderick built her adult identity around giving things up so a shared future could exist. From the beginning of the marriage, her role was defined by support rather than self-advancement. She married young, raised 4 children, and organized her life around the demands of her husband's education and career. Moves between states were frequent. Financial uncertainty was constant. Each transition required her to restart socially, emotionally, and practically. These were not framed as temporary hardships. They were understood as contributions toward a life that would eventually belong to both of them. The sacrifices extended beyond time and labor. Betty did not pursue an independent professional identity while Daniel studied and retrained. She managed the household, handled childcare, maintained schedules, and absorbed instability so that her husband could focus entirely on advancement. When Daniel left medical school and entered law school, the family's timeline reset again. Years of effort were pushed further into the future. Betty adjusted without protest. In her mind, this reinforced the belief that sacrifice was being recorded, stored, and would one day be acknowledged. Success arrived, but recognition did not follow in the way she expected. Daniel Broderick III became a highly successful medical malpractice lawyer in San Diego. Income increased dramatically. Status followed. With that shift came a change in authority inside the marriage. Friends later described growing distance and resentment. Betty's role as supporter no longer held the same weight. The years she spent managing the household and raising children did not translate into equal control over money or decisions. What she believed she had earned through sacrifice was not reflected in daily reality. When the marriage collapsed, the divorce transformed sacrifice into grievance. The legal process stretched on for years. Court rulings focused on ownership, income, and custody standards. Judges ordered Betty to vacate properties that were no longer legally hers. Support payments were structured according to California law, not emotional history. To the court, these were routine outcomes. To Betty, they felt like dismissal. The life she believed she helped build was being redistributed without her consent. Daniel's conduct during the divorce added fuel to that perception. Court records and testimony showed that Daniel imposed a strict and punitive system around financial support. He kept detailed accounting records and deducted money from Betty's support payments as fines. These deductions were applied when she used language he deemed obscene in voicemail messages or when she entered properties that the court had awarded to him. From Daniel's perspective, this was enforcement of boundaries and compliance with court orders. From Betty's perspective, it felt controlling, humiliating, and calculated to provoke. Each deduction reinforced her belief that she was being disciplined rather than divorced. These actions mattered because they altered how Betty experienced power. Support payments were no longer seen as neutral legal obligations. They became instruments of control. Language was monitored. Physical presence was penalized. The system turned everyday behavior into financial consequence. Over time, this fed a growing sense that her life was being managed by rules designed to punish rather than resolve. Sacrifice, in her memory, hardened into entitlement. Entitlement turned into rage when it was denied. Behavior escalated as belief solidified. Betty's actions grew more aggressive and visible. After being ordered to leave a home awarded to Daniel, she spray-painted angry messages inside the property. In another incident, she drove her car through the front door of the same house. These acts brought police involvement and court response. Prosecutors later used them to demonstrate fixation and intent. Betty viewed them differently. In her mind, they were protests against a system that erased her contributions and enforced obedience through humiliation. The children were drawn into the conflict as well. Evidence introduced at trial included recordings of long, hostile voicemail messages Betty left on Daniel's answering machine. Prosecutors described the language as aggressive and accusatory. Some messages were left when the children were present or listening. The dispute was no longer confined to courtrooms. It entered the family space. Memory reshaped the past into a single, rigid explanation. Court rulings were no longer remembered as applications of law. They were recalled as deliberate humiliations. Daniel's enforcement of fines and deductions was not remembered as boundary setting. It became proof in her mind of cruelty and control. Responsibility shifted outward. Her own actions faded into the background. The past narrowed until grievance dominated every interpretation. Daniel's remarriage in 1988 intensified that framework. When he married Linda Colkina, a former legal assistant from his office, the marriage symbolized continuation. To the legal system, it marked life after divorce. To Betty, it felt like replacement. Years of sacrifice were now contrasted against a new household she was excluded from. Anger that once targeted courts and procedures focused sharply on people. By 1989, the structure was set. There were restraining orders. There were documented confrontations. There were no signs of reconciliation or emotional closure. Legally, most matters were settled. Internally, sacrifice still demanded repayment. Memory continued to frame the past as unfinished business that justified continued hostility. On November 5, 1989, the consequences became permanent. Betty drove to the San Diego home where Daniel and Linda lived. She entered while they were asleep and used a revolver to shoot them both. Daniel Broderick III and Linda Colcana. Broderick died from their wounds. These facts have never been disputed. Betty later turned herself in. The question before the court was not what happened, but how it should be judged. The first trial in 1990 exposed two interpretations of the same history. Prosecutors emphasized planning, prior threats, property damage, and the deliberate decision to bring a firearm into the home. The system of fines and financial penalties was introduced to show a prolonged power struggle that had escalated into violence. The defense focused on emotional collapse, arguing that years of conflict had overwhelmed Betty's ability to respond rationally. The jury deadlocked. A mistrial followed. In 1991, a second jury reached a verdict. Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. The jury rejected the claim that sacrifice or emotional pain removed responsibility. Under California law, intent was established. The sentence closed the case legally, but not psychologically. Parole hearing records show a consistent pattern. Betty continues to describe herself primarily as a victim of injustice and control. Parole boards have repeatedly cited her refusal to fully accept responsibility as a reason for denial. Moving on to the fourth case, but before we do, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel as we move deeper into these cases. Now, to case number 4. Jacksonville Beach, Florida was quiet on the night of February 16, 2022, when a single stretch of road became the center of a homicide investigation that would stretch across states and years. The area was residential, dimly lit, and familiar to Jared Bridegan, who had driven it many times before. That night, prosecutors say the location was not chosen by chance. Bridegan was driving his SUV after dropping off 2 of his children at his former wife's home. His 2-year-old daughter was secured in a car seat in the back. As he traveled along Sanctuary Boulevard, investigators allege that a tire had been deliberately placed in the roadway, blocking his path. When Bridegan slowed or stopped to assess the obstruction, he was shot and killed. His daughter survived unharmed and was later found nearby, still strapped into her seat. From the outset, police treated the scene as targeted. There were no signs of robbery. Nothing was taken from the vehicle. The placement of the tire, the timing, and the isolation of the road suggested planning rather than coincidence. Detectives quickly began looking beyond the crime scene and into Bridegan's personal history. Bridegan was a father of 4 and a technology professional. After divorcing Shanna Gardner, also known in court records as Shanna Gardner Fernandez, the two remained connected through custody arrangements and ongoing legal disputes. Court records and reporting show that the years following the divorce were marked by repeated conflict over parenting schedules and finances. Over time, Bridegan remarried and built a new household. Friends and family described his life as increasingly stable. Prosecutors argue that this stability did not bring closure. Instead, they say, it became a source of resentment. In the state's theory, Bridegan's emotional distance and new family life were perceived not as separation, but as replacement. That belief, prosecutors allege, hardened over years. The investigation moved slowly at first, but gained momentum in January 2023 with the arrest of Henry Tenon. Tenon later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and admitted he was the gunman. In sworn statements, he told investigators he had been paid to carry out the killing and agreed to cooperate with the state. Tenon's cooperation became a turning point. He identified others whom prosecutors allege were involved in planning and financing the attack. That information led investigators to Mario Fernandez Saldana, Gardner's husband at the time, and eventually to Gardner herself. Prosecutors allege that Gardner and Fernandez worked together to arrange Bridegan's death, framing the case as a murder-for-hire plot supported by financial records, communications data, and digital evidence. Gardner was arrested in August 2023 in Washington state, where she had relocated. She challenged extradition, but was ultimately returned to Florida. In court, she pleaded not guilty. Her defense has consistently rejected the prosecution's narrative, arguing that the case relies heavily on the testimony of a cooperating witness with strong incentives to reduce his own sentence. That argument gained additional force in 2025, when Tenon indicated that he might seek to withdraw his guilty plea. According to court filings, Tenon claimed that portions of his earlier testimony were false and suggested he felt pressured during plea negotiations. Although the court has not permitted him to undo his plea, the development introduced uncertainty. For the defense, it became a central point. If the admitted gunman now questions his own account, they argue the reliability of the prosecution's case must be carefully examined. Prosecutors counter that Tenon's statements are supported by independent evidence. They note that recantation attempts are not uncommon when a cooperating defendant confronts the reality of a long prison sentence. As of early 2026, Tenon's plea remains in place, and his cooperation has not been formally invalidated. How much weight a jury will place on his testimony remains unresolved. The court has also had to confront the practical challenge of managing a case of this size. The prosecution has produced thousands of digital files, including extracted phone data, financial records, and communications. During hearings in 2025, defense attorneys reported technical difficulties unzipping and reviewing the material, describing the evidence as voluminous. Judges acknowledged on the record that the scale of digital evidence contributed to delays and pushed the trial timeline further into 2026. Because of the case's profile and complexity, the presiding judge has discussed extraordinary jury management measures. Among them is the possibility of summoning up to 500 potential jurors to address pretrial publicity. The court has also suggested using two separate juries, one for Gardner and one for Fernandez, to prevent prejudice and ensure that evidence is considered only against the appropriate defendant. While uncommon, such arrangements have been considered in complex conspiracy cases. A major legal shift occurred in November 2025 when prosecutors formally withdrew their intent to seek the death penalty against both Gardner and Fernandez. The decision did not reduce the severity of the charges, which still carry the possibility of life imprisonment. Instead, it changed the long-term trajectory of the case. Court reporting indicated that the withdrawal was supported by Bridegan's widow, who expressed concern about the emotional toll that decades of death penalty appeals could place on the children. Prosecutors acknowledged that consideration in court, framing the decision as one shaped by the interests of the surviving family rather than by doubts about the evidence. Another clarification concerns custody. While custody disputes form part of the historical background prosecutors cite as motive, the custody battle itself ended in late 2024. A Florida court ruled that the twins Bridegan shared with Gardner would remain with Gardner's parents, formally ending the guardianship dispute between maternal and paternal grandparents. That ruling resolved a long-running collateral legal fight even as the criminal case continued. As of early 2026, the next immediate step is a pretrial hearing scheduled for February 6, 2026, in Duval County. That hearing is expected to address outstanding motions, witness issues, including matters related to Tenon, and trial logistics, including jury selection procedures. Throughout all proceedings, Gardner has maintained her innocence. No jury has yet heard the full case. No verdict has been reached. Legally, the matter remains in its pretrial phase, shaped by contested testimony, procedural safeguards, and extensive digital review. What is fully true has yet to be decided, and now our attention advances to the fifth case. Custody conflict defined the relationship between Melissa Merritt and her former husband, Caleb Harrison, after their marriage ended. What followed was not a clean separation, but years of court orders, supervision, and escalating legal pressure that steadily stripped influence from one side while deepening fixation on the family unit itself. Melissa Merritt and Caleb Harrison shared 2 children. After their separation, custody became the dominant force shaping their lives. Court records and media reporting describe a prolonged and bitter dispute marked by repeated hearings and restrictions. As rulings narrowed Merritt's authority over the children, the conflict intensified rather than resolved. The issue was no longer just access, but control: who decided where the children lived, who guided their daily routines, and who held legal authority when disagreements arose. In 2009, that conflict reached a breaking point. Merritt took the children from Ontario and fled to Nova Scotia without authorization, an act later described in court as a parental abduction. Police were involved. The children were located and returned. The incident ended with stricter court oversight and tighter limits on Merritt's autonomy as a parent. From that moment forward, the custody battle shifted from emotional disagreement to enforced legal boundaries. That same year, the first death occurred inside the Harrison family home in Mississauga. Bill Harrison, Caleb's father, died in 2009. At the time, his death was attributed to natural causes and was not treated as a homicide. No criminal charges were laid. Life continued inside the house, and the custody dispute remained the primary source of tension between Merritt and the Harrison family. Years later, when investigators revisited the case, Christopher Fattore was charged in connection with Bill Harrison's death. In 2018, Fattore was acquitted of that charge, and any charges against Merritt related to Bill had already been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Legally, Bill Harrison's death resulted in no convictions. In 2010, the Mississauga home became the site of another tragedy. Bridget Harrison, Caleb's mother, was found dead at the bottom of the stairs. Once again, investigators did not initially classify the death as a homicide. It was ruled accidental or undetermined, and no arrests followed. At the time, there was no public suggestion that the death was linked to the earlier loss of Bill Harrison or to the ongoing custody battle. The family remained in the home, and outwardly, the past appeared settled. But the custody dispute did not settle. Court filings and later testimony showed that the years following Bridget's death were marked by continued legal friction. Merritt's access to the children became more restricted. Oversight increased. Each ruling reduced her leverage. Prosecutors would later argue that these developments mattered because they shaped behavior over time. When legal authority diminished, proximity became more important. The Harrison home remained a place where access still existed, even as formal control disappeared. In 2013, the pattern changed decisively. Caleb Harrison was found dead in his bedroom inside the Mississauga house. A post-mortem examination determined that he had died by asphyxiation. Unlike the earlier deaths, this one was immediately classified as a homicide. The ruling forced police to re-examine the entire history of the house, the family, and the relationships that surrounded it. What had once been treated as unrelated losses were now reviewed as potential parts of a longer progression. Investigators focused on Melissa Merritt and Christopher Fattore. According to prosecutors, Merritt's continued access to the Harrison household years after her marriage ended was central to the case. The Crown did not present the killing as a sudden act driven by emotion. Instead, it described escalation, a custody battle that narrowed authority, repeated legal defeats, and a fixation on the family environment that remained physically accessible, even as control over the children vanished. In January 2014, Merritt and Fattore were arrested in Nova Scotia and charged in connection with the deaths of Caleb Harrison and Bridget Harrison. The arrests brought national attention to a case that had quietly developed over several years. Prosecutors framed the story around loss of influence. Communication failed, legal avenues closed, presence became the remaining method of asserting relevance. According to the Crown, violence emerged not as an impulsive decision, but as the final stage of that progression. At trial, the custody conflict featured prominently. Prosecutors pointed to its timing. noting that major legal setbacks closely preceded periods of heightened tension. The argument was not that Merritt acted alone or suddenly, but that prolonged litigation and perceived loss of authority created a narrowing focus on the Harrison family unit. Fattore, the Crown alleged, acted within that framework, carrying out acts that Merritt could no longer execute herself. In 2018, the jury delivered mixed verdicts that reflected the complexity of the case. Both Merritt and Fattore were found guilty of the murder of Caleb Harrison. On the charge related to Bridget Harrison's death, Fattore was convicted. The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict regarding Merritt's responsibility for Bridget's death, resulting in a mistrial on that count. As clarified in court records, Fattore was acquitted of Bill Harrison's death, and charges against Merritt for Bill had been dropped earlier due to insufficient evidence. The legal process continued beyond those verdicts. In later proceedings, Merritt entered a guilty plea to manslaughter in connection with Caleb Harrison's death. The plea reflected the evidentiary record as it stood after years of litigation. She received a custodial sentence consistent with that conviction. By the mid-2000s, Canadian media reported that Merritt had completed her sentence and was no longer incarcerated, prompting renewed discussion about delayed accountability and the long arc of justice. 2 individuals charged, 2 lives lost. We now proceed to the 6th case. Justice Lex Lasry said the planning was lengthy, careful, and designed to avoid criminal liability. From the bench, he made it clear that what occurred was not the result of panic, rage, or emotional collapse. It was the product of sustained decision-making. He described recorded phone calls as extraordinarily matter-of-fact and stated that Bianca Edmonds used intense sexual manipulation to pressure another person into committing violence on her behalf. Most critically, he said Edmonds displayed an extreme degree of entitlement, choosing homicidal violence instead of resolving conflict through the family law system. Bianca Edmonds was not present at the house where her former partner, Michael Capociana, was killed, but the court found that the violence began long before anyone arrived at his door. Edmonds and Capociana had once been engaged and shared a young son. When the relationship ended, their connection did not. It continued through custody arrangements, legal proceedings, and disputes over parental authority. According to the court, Edmonds did not accept separation as a condition that required cooperation or restraint. She experienced it as a loss of control. Family law existed to manage that conflict. Parenting orders, court processes, and mediation were available. Justice Lasry emphasized that Edmonds rejected all of it. He stated that she viewed the system not as a lawful framework to resolve disagreement, but as an inconvenience standing in the way of what she wanted. This sense of entitlement became central to the case. Capociana's autonomy as a parent was not treated as a right. It was treated as provocation. Rather than adjusting to shared authority, Edmonds reframed Capociana's continued involvement in their son's life as an unacceptable intrusion. His attempts to exercise parental rights were interpreted as interference. The court found that this perspective hardened over time. It did not soften. The longer the dispute continued, the more Edmonds came to see lawful resolution as something to be bypassed rather than endured. By 2016, Edmonds was married to Glenn Cassidy. Evidence presented at trial showed that she repeatedly pressured him to confront Capociana. This pressure was not brief or ambiguous. Justice Lasry described it as sustained, deliberate, and manipulative. He found that Edmonds deliberately positioned herself away from the physical act while ensuring it would occur. The court noted that she applied pressure in a way designed to motivate Cassidy while preserving distance from criminal liability. Recorded phone calls between Edmonds and Cassidy became a key part of the prosecution case. They were played for the jury. Lasry described them as unusually calm, practical, and stripped of emotion. There was no panic, no distress, and no sign of hesitation. Instead, the conversations reflected planning and acceptance. The judge said they revealed a mindset in which killing was treated as a solution to a problem. not as an unthinkable act. The plan culminated in Cassidy going to Caposiena's home in West Meadows, Victoria, in 2016. He went armed. This was not a chance encounter or a dispute that escalated unexpectedly. The court was clear that it was a planned home invasion. During the confrontation, Caposiena resisted and stabbed Cassidy. Cassidy then shot Caposiena, killing him. Cassidy later died from his injuries. By the end of the encounter, 2 men were dead. The aftermath exposed the full cost of the decision Edmonds had made. The custody dispute that had driven the planning no longer existed. It had been erased through violence. The child at the center of the conflict was left without a father and soon without a mother present as well. The criminal proceedings that followed were unusually complex. Edmonds did not face a single trial. She faced 3. The first trial ended with a hung jury. The second resulted in the jury being discharged before a verdict could be reached. It was not until December 2022, at the 3rd trial, that a jury unanimously found her guilty of murder. The verdict reflected acceptance of the prosecution's argument that Edmonds intentionally encouraged and assisted the killing, even though she was not physically present. Under Australian law, a person can be guilty of murder if they intentionally assist, encourage, or direct another to commit the act. Physical absence does not remove responsibility. The jury concluded that Edmonds' conduct met that standard. The verdict confirmed that distance from the scene did not equal distance from the crime. At sentencing in October 2023, Justice Lasry delivered findings that left little room for mitigation. He rejected any portrayal of Edmonds as overwhelmed or emotionally unstable. He stated that she had made a conscious decision to use lethal violence to avoid the inconvenience of family law. He emphasized that the planning was not only deliberate but structured to reduce her exposure. The sentence imposed was 26 years imprisonment, with a non-parole period of 20 years. Here, loyalty to a partner became lethal, costing 2 lives. This video now turns to the 7th case. The divorce between Deborah Dunanko and Kevin Phelan was finalized in 2000, 4 years after they married in 1996. On paper, the relationship was finished. The legal bond was dissolved, and each went their separate way. But the separation did not erase the history they shared, nor did it dismantle the patterns that had already taken root. More than a decade later, those unresolved dynamics would pull them back together. By 2012, Dunanko and Phelan had reunited and were once again living together in a rural home near Glendon, Alberta. The reunion did not represent a fresh beginning. It reopened a relationship shaped by years of conflict, volatility, and abuse. Court records later showed that the same problems that had contributed to the original breakup resurfaced quickly. Arguments followed familiar paths. Control and fear reemerged as defining features of daily life. The past was not left behind. It was reactivated. This pattern of separation and reunion mattered deeply to what came next. Each return reinforced the sense that escape was temporary. Each conflict reinforced the belief that danger was constant. Over time, fear became normalized. What might have once felt unacceptable became expected. On the night of May 25, 2014, Deborah Dunanko and Kevin Phelan were both inside their shared home. Later court proceedings clarified important details about what happened inside that house before the fatal shots were fired. As part of an agreed statement of facts entered during the manslaughter plea, the court accepted that Phelan discharged a rifle into the floor shortly before he was shot. This detail was not incidental. It was formally recognized as an escalation that directly influenced Dunanko's perception of immediate danger. Moments after the rifle was fired into the floor, Dunanko shot Phelan twice in the chest, causing fatal injuries. The fact that she fired the shots was never disputed. The legal question centered on context, perception, and responsibility. The firing of the rifle inside the home was treated as evidence that the threat felt real and immediate, particularly when viewed against the backdrop of a long history of abuse. What followed the shooting became just as important to the legal analysis. Dunanko did not call emergency services immediately. A fire was deliberately set inside the home, and she left the scene. When firefighters and police arrived, they found Kevin Phelan dead inside the burned structure. In her initial interactions with first responders, Dunanko did not disclose that she had shot him. She suggested instead that Phelan had caused the fire. Later that day, under further questioning, she admitted that she had fired the fatal shots. These actions formed the foundation of the original criminal charges. Deborah Dunanko was charged with second-degree murder, arson, and committing an indignity to a body, a charge also referred to in court documents as indecently interfering with human remains. The case moved forward with two sharply different interpretations of the same facts. One focused on fear shaped by years of abuse. The other focused on intent demonstrated through decisions made after the shooting. At trial, the defense presented extensive evidence describing a prolonged history of abuse. Expert testimony explained how repeated exposure to violence can alter perception, threat assessment, and decision-making. The argument was not that Dunanko acted without awareness or understanding, but that her perception of danger was shaped by lived experience rather than a single moment. Within that framework, the firing of the rifle into the floor was not symbolic or minor. It was confirmation of an immediate threat in an environment where fear had already been reinforced many times over. The Crown acknowledged that the relationship was troubled, but emphasized the steps taken after the shooting. Prosecutors argued that setting the fire, leaving the home, and delaying disclosure showed time to reflect and make choices. These actions, they said, weakened any claim that the killing was unavoidable. In November 2016, a jury accepted the Crown's position. Deborah Dunanko was found guilty of second-degree murder, arson, and committing an indignity to a body. She received a life sentence consistent with Canadian law for second-degree murder. The verdict did not bring the legal process to an end. Dunanko appealed the conviction, arguing that the trial judge had improperly limited expert psychological evidence related to long-term abuse. The appeal did not dispute that Kevin Phelan had been killed or that she had fired the shots. It focused on whether the jury had been given a fair opportunity to fully understand how prolonged abuse affected her perception of threat and decision-making. In 2020, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that errors had occurred in how expert evidence was handled at trial. The court ordered a new trial, emphasizing that when self-defense is raised in the context of prolonged abuse, juries must be allowed to properly consider expert evidence explaining that context. The ruling did not declare innocence or negate the facts of the case. It addressed fairness in the legal process. Before a second jury trial took place, the case was resolved through a negotiated plea. Deborah Dunanko pleaded guilty to manslaughter. During the plea hearing, several critical clarifications were formally accepted by the court. The agreed statement of facts confirmed that Phelan had fired the rifle into the floor immediately before he was shot, reinforcing the immediacy of the threat as Dunanko perceived it. Most significantly, the court officially recognized Kevin Phelan's history as a serial abuser. This was not casual language. It was a judicial finding that played a decisive role in reducing the charge from murder to manslaughter. The recognition placed the fatal encounter within a documented pattern of abuse rather than treating it as an isolated confrontation occurring in a vacuum. At sentencing, the court imposed a term of 8 years in prison, with credit for 4 years already served. The sentence reflected a balance between accountability for causing Kevin Phelan's death and acknowledgement of the abusive context that shaped the final encounter. Accountability and abusive context were placed side by side to deliver a verdict. Next in line is the 8th case. Tanya Lindell Saucier began her adult life in the military, inside an institution built on discipline, sequencing, and controlled response. Military training emphasizes patience over impulse and procedure over emotion. After completing her service, she became a nurse, entering another profession where restraint, attention, and responsibility are essential. For years, her life followed systems designed to preserve life. Her marriage to James Ray Saucier deteriorated over time into a prolonged and volatile separation. By 2023, the conflict had moved far beyond marital dispute and into criminal court. Prosecutors alleged that James Saucier shot Tanya 5 times during a domestic incident that year. One gunshot struck her in the face, causing the loss of her right eye. Medical records and court filings also documented traumatic brain injuries that followed. These injuries were severe, permanent, and life-altering. They affected not only her appearance and physical health, but her neurological functioning as well. James Ray Saucier was charged in connection with that 2023 shooting, including aggravated assault and domestic violence with a deadly weapon. His criminal case was moving forward while the divorce proceeded separately. That meant the person accused of nearly killing Tanya remained legally present in her life through court schedules, filings, and mandated appearances. Separation did not remove risk. It reorganized it. Tanya's life became structured around recovery, fear management, and repeated court involvement tied to the same individual. By late 2024, the divorce reached its final stage. Recognizing the volatility of the situation, the Pearl River County Chancery Court in Poplarville, Mississippi, implemented separation measures for the final hearing on December 17, 2024. Tanya was scheduled for a 10 a.m. session. James was scheduled for an 11 a.m. session. The intent was to keep them apart and reduce the risk of contact. Inside the courthouse, the plan worked. Tanya attended her hearing. The judge concluded the proceedings. Reports vary slightly on whether the divorce was fully finalized or whether the final paperwork was being processed at that moment, but all accounts agree on one point: the marriage had effectively ended when the violence occurred. After her hearing, Tanya did not immediately leave the courthouse grounds. According to investigators, she waited in her truck. When James Ray Saucier exited the building after his later session, Tanya approached. Prosecutors allege she produced a firearm and shot him outside the courthouse in a public area within view of attorneys and bystanders. James was pronounced dead at the scene. The speed of the event is critical. There was no prolonged argument observed, no extended confrontation captured. The distance between decision and consequence collapsed into seconds. Legal analysts often describe this type of moment through the lens of immediacy distortion. In such a state, time compresses psychologically. Waiting feels unsafe. The future is perceived as threatening rather than uncertain. Fear of what might happen outweighs awareness of what will happen after acting. Long-term consequences, arrest, trial, imprisonment, lose relevance. Action feels necessary and final. The aftermath unfolded almost immediately. Tanya did not flee. Eyewitnesses reported that her own divorce attorney, Jansen Owen, physically intervened, subduing her at the scene and holding her until law enforcement arrived. Police took her into custody moments later. The scene stabilized quickly, but the outcome was irreversible. Tanya Saucier was charged with murder and initially held at the Pearl River County Jail. As the case progressed, significant developments followed. On August 5, 2025, Special Judge Steve Simpson denied her request for bond. During the hearing, District Attorney Hal Cottrell argued that Tanya posed both a special danger and a flight risk. The judge agreed, formally designating her as such. Following the bond denial, Tanya was transferred from the Pearl River County Jail to the Lamar County Jail, where she remains held without bond. As of January 2026, no definitive trial date has been publicly set. Tanya remains in custody awaiting trial on the murder charge. Under Mississippi law, a conviction could result in life imprisonment. Despite the severity of the charge and the publicity surrounding the case, she remains legally innocent until proven guilty. Another major development occurred as a direct consequence of James Saucier's death. His criminal case stemming from the 2023 shooting was terminated. James had been scheduled to stand trial on March 4, 2025, for the alleged attack that caused Tanya's eye loss and brain injuries. Because he was killed on December 17, 2024, those proceedings were dismissed. The legal system never reached a verdict on the allegations against him. Legal analysts have widely suggested that Tanya's defense may focus on the neurological impact of her documented brain injuries combined with a history of domestic violence. Medical experts are expected to testify about how traumatic brain injury can affect impulse control, emotional regulation, and perception of urgency. Within that framework, immediacy distortion is not presented as justification, but as a mechanism that may explain how decision-making became compressed under stress. Prosecutors, however, maintain that no medical history provides legal justification for a public shooting outside a courthouse. They are expected to emphasize behavior, timing, and location. The separation measures, Tanya's decision to wait in her vehicle, and the public nature of the shooting are likely to be presented as evidence of intent rather than panic. From that perspective, the moment the divorce ended represented a loss of legal control that triggered deliberate action. As clarity is sought, the story shifts into the ninth case. Studies cited by the World Health Organization consistently show that separation is not a calm endpoint in relationships marked by conflict. Instead, it is often a period of heightened risk, particularly when one partner struggles to accept loss or the end of control. That reality provides the most accurate starting point for understanding the case of Amy Pugh and the death of her estranged husband, Kyle Pugh, a case shaped not by a single outburst, but by separation, fixation, and a series of deliberate decisions made after violence had already occurred. Amy and Kyle Pugh were no longer living as husband and wife. Their marriage had ended in law, but evidence presented at trial showed that emotional conflict did not dissolve with that legal separation. Contact continued. Resentment remained unresolved. Disputes followed the relationship forward rather than staying in the past. Research supported by the National Institute of Justice explains that when violence occurs after separation, it is rarely driven by an isolated argument. Instead, it is often tied to perceived humiliation, loss of identity, and a belief that control has been unfairly taken away. Separation becomes something to resist rather than accept. This period is especially unstable because it combines distance with continued access. The relationship is no longer shared, but it is not fully released. Psychological studies referenced by the American Psychological Association describe this condition as fixation following relationship breakdown. The separation exists on paper, but not psychologically. Loss is not processed as final. It is experienced as an injustice that demands correction. Each interaction narrows perspective further, reinforcing grievance rather than resolution. The prosecution in the Pugh case emphasized that the killing of Kyle Pugh did not occur in isolation from this pattern. It was not presented as a sudden loss of control. Instead, the court examined intent, timing, and behavior before and after the fatal injury. What followed the violence became central to the case. After Kyle sustained severe injuries, Amy Pugh did not immediately seek medical assistance. Evidence showed that she waited approximately 20 minutes before calling emergency services. During that period, prosecutors demonstrated that she attempted to make the scene appear as though Kyle had taken his own life rather than been assaulted. This was not treated as confusion or panic. Medical experts testified that Kyle might have survived if help had been summoned sooner. The delay, measured in minutes, became one of the most consequential elements of the case. The court was clear that this decision reduced his chances of survival. This finding reflects patterns repeatedly documented in UK domestic homicide reviews overseen by the UK Home Office. These reviews show that control in intimate partner violence does not always end with the attack itself. It often continues through actions taken afterward, through delay, denial, or attempts to shape the narrative of what occurred. Harm is not limited to the injury. It extends into the choices that determine whether a victim receives timely help. On September 5, 2025, the case reached sentencing at Stafford Crown Court. Amy Pugh was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge imposed a minimum term of 13 years and 77 days before she will be eligible to apply for parole. While media reports often round this figure to 13 or 14 years, the precise minimum term is fixed by the court. Under the law of England and Wales, a life sentence means lifelong supervision. Even if parole is granted in the future, the sentence itself never expires. In delivering judgment, the judge described Amy Pugh's actions as cynical and cruel. This language reflected not only the fatal injury, but the conduct that followed it. The deliberate delay in contacting emergency services and the attempt to mislead responders were treated as aggravating factors. The court emphasized that Kyle's survival chances were reduced by these choices. This reasoning aligns closely with findings from domestic homicide reviews, which frequently show that post-incident behavior can be as decisive as the initial act of violence. Deliberate delay eliminates the slightest chance of survival. And with that, we move to the final case. The event began in the early hours of October 13th to 14th, 2002, inside a pool house cottage on a family estate in Arinda, California. A teenage boy, shaken and panicked, called emergency services and told the dispatcher his father had been shot. Police and paramedics rushed to the property expecting a firearm injury. What they found instead would reshape an entire family's history and begin a legal case that would stretch across decades. Inside the cottage, Frank Felix Polk, known to friends as Felix, was dead. The initial report of a shooting quickly fell apart. An autopsy confirmed that he had been stabbed 27 times and had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. There was no gunshot wound. The injuries showed a sustained, violent attack rather than a single defensive act. From the first hours of the investigation, there was no dispute about who was responsible. Frank Polk's wife, Susan Polk, acknowledged that she had caused his death. What followed was not a search for a suspect, but a search for meaning. Susan Polk told investigators that she believed her husband was about to kill her. She said the violence in the pool house was an act of self-defense, driven by fear rooted in years of alleged abuse. According to her account, the marriage had been defined by control, intimidation, and sexual violence, and separation had not ended that fear. She described the night as a moment where she believed there was no safe escape. The physical evidence told a different story, one that would become central to the prosecution's case. The number of stab wounds, the presence of blunt force trauma, and the setting itself suggested a prolonged struggle rather than a sudden reaction to an immediate threat. Prosecutors would later argue that even when viewed against a background of marital conflict, the force used went far beyond what California law allows as self-defense. At the time of the killing, Susan and Frank Polk were separated and in the process of divorcing. The marriage had not ended cleanly. They shared children, property, and years of unresolved resentment. Legal separation had not produced emotional distance. Contact continued. Accusations continued. The relationship had shifted from partnership to conflict, but it had not dissolved. The location of the killing reflected that unresolved state. The pool house cottage was part of shared property, a space still tied to both of them. The confrontation did not occur in a neutral place or during a chance encounter. It happened within the boundaries of a life that had not fully separated. As the investigation progressed, the case moved slowly into the court system. This was not a swift march to trial. Proceedings stretched on for years, in part because of significant disruptions. In 2005, Susan Polk's original defense attorney withdrew after his wife was murdered in an unrelated case. The loss forced a change in legal representation and caused major delays. By the time the case finally reached a jury, nearly 4 years had passed since Frank Polk's death. When the trial began in 2006 in Contra Costa County Superior Court, jurors were presented with two incompatible narratives. The defense asked them to understand Susan Polk's actions through the lens of prolonged abuse and psychological terror. The prosecution asked them to focus on the moment of violence itself, on what happened in the pool house, how much force was used, and whether the law permitted that force under any circumstances. Jurors were instructed carefully. They were told that allegations of abuse could be considered, but that self-defense under California law required more than fear. It required an immediate threat, necessity, and proportionality. The question before them was not whether Susan Polk had been afraid in her marriage. It was whether the killing of Frank Polk was legally justified at that specific moment. Forensic testimony played a critical role. Medical experts described the injuries in detail. 27 stab wounds, blunt force trauma to the head, no evidence of a firearm, no signs that Frank Polk was armed in a way that would explain lethal force as unavoidable. The prosecution argued that these facts showed intent and excess, not necessity. The defense countered that prolonged abuse can distort perception, making threats feel immediate even when they are not obvious to outsiders. They urged jurors to consider how fear accumulates and how victims of abuse may act when they believe their lives are in danger. The courtroom became a place where psychology and law collided, each operating under different rules. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. In 2006, Susan Polk was convicted of second-degree murder. The verdict rejected both premeditated murder and lawful self-defense. It meant the jury concluded that Frank Polk was intentionally killed, but not as part of a planned execution, and that the killing was not legally justified. Sentencing followed. The court imposed a term of 16 years to life in prison. That sentence included 15 years to life for second-degree murder, plus a mandatory 1-year enhancement for the use of a deadly weapon, the knife. The structure of the sentence reflected the court's view that the manner of death mattered as much as the outcome. Susan Polk was sent to state prison. Over time, the case continued to surface in public discussion. Supporters argued that the legal system failed to account for the psychological impact of long-term abuse. Critics pointed to the forensic evidence as incompatible with self-defense. Appeals were filed, but the conviction remained in place. As of 2026, Susan Polk remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California. Her first parole suitability hearing, held in 2019, resulted in a denial. The California Board of Parole Hearings issued a 10-year deferral, concluding that she did not yet present a sufficiently reduced risk to public safety. That decision made her next parole eligibility date 2029. Susan Polk later sought to have that hearing advanced. The request was reviewed under California parole procedures. In July 2025, the request was denied, leaving the original deferral intact. No parole date has been set and no release has been approved. Thanks for watching. Kindly smash the like button and subscribe to my channel.